There's been an awful lot of talk, of course, about the crew crisis and the fact that hundreds of thousands of crew were stranded on board ships. But I would like to share today a couple of examples which have not been so talked about.
Welcome to the Shipping Podcast, where I meet interesting maritime professionals sharing their passion for the shipping industry and their everyday job. I am your host. My name is Lena Gothberg. Hello, Shipping Podcast listeners, and welcome to episode 188. Whoever you are and wherever you are, thank you for tuning in and listening to the Shipping Podcast. This is where we talk about the coolest industry on the planet and help raise the maritime industry's profile. Today it's May 20th. I hope you celebrated the International Day for Women in Maritime on the 18th, last Wednesday. The IMO Assembly adopted a resolution last December proclaiming an International Day for Women in Maritime to be observed on May 18th every year. This one was the first. I genuinely enjoy all the conversations I have had on the Shipping Podcast. I hope that you have noticed that more than half of the guests here are female. But I don't interview them because they are female. I interview them because they have exciting jobs and are passionate about the maritime industry. It took me 5 years to achieve equilibrium, to have as many female guests as male. If I hadn't set up that goal from the start, I would never have reached the point where we are today. Start by setting a goal. Having said that, today's conversation is a nugget. I had the great pleasure of speaking to Alice Amundsen, Vice President and Senior Adviser at Gard, about her career and her experiences as a claims handler for people's claims during the pandemic. You are in for a treat. This is Alice Amundsen for you. Welcome to the Shipping Podcast. Could you please introduce yourself?
Yes, hello everyone, and thank you very much for inviting me, Lena. It's a real honor to be on your podcast. So my name is Alice Amundsen, and I'm a Vice President and Senior Advisor for the marine insurer Gard. I'm soon to retire after almost 35 years in the shipping industry, and I'm based in Gard's headquarters in Arendal in southern Norway.
And what is your background?
Well, I'm British, but I've now lived in Norway for longer than I've actually lived in England. I studied law at University College London many years ago, and I started my legal career off as an English solicitor. I specialised in corporate law at that time, and I was working mainly with mergers and acquisitions. But, you know, I was a really avid sailor in my teenage years and early 20s. My parents have no idea where this love for the sea comes from. No one in my family has a connection to the sea, has worked in the shipping industry. And I actually grew up in rural Gloucestershire, so it's a bit of a mystery where this fascination has come from. But I ended up sailing both on lakes, around the coast, and eventually ventured to sea and even oceans. And I got so interested that I studied navigation, and I ended up qualifying as an ocean master and owned my own sailboat. And then, you know, when I have an interest, I tend to go full in, and I realized whilst I was working in a dusty old room and trying to get two parties to agree on the terms of an acquisition agreement, that maybe I could use my navigation skills in my work. And so I then turned to maritime law and joined an English law firm that specialised in that area. And I learnt my trade, and off I went into the world of shipping. And then it became my dream to work overseas, and so I started to look for different jobs overseas. At that time, and we're talking back in the 80s, it wasn't so common for English law firms to have overseas offices. So I did end up getting a job with a New York law firm. But then, just as I was about to accept, I saw an advertisement in the Times newspaper in England for an English lawyer at the headquarters of the Gard P&I Club in Arendal, Norway. And I just thought, Southern Norway sounds like a lot of sailing, and I jumped at the chance. And I moved to Gard. I did leave Gard for a while because I wasn't sure that I wanted to settle down in this small, sleepy town of Arendal. And I did go back to private practice with an English law firm in Hong Kong. And that was while Hong Kong was still a British colony. It was a fantastic experience. You felt really at the cutting edge of shipping because the ships were there, the ship owners were there, and when there was a problem, you could really be a part of the action. So that was great fun. But at the time, it was a very transient place. And believe it or not, I was the only female English or female solicitor working in the firm. And it didn't really feel, much like home. So I knew that there was an opportunity waiting for me back at Gard. And I returned, and 30 years later, here I am.
Exciting. You never know where life takes you. And I think that is something that people in the maritime industry actually look forward to. Different things, and things are changing. So what is Gard? What is a P&I club? Could we maybe talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. As we all know, shipping is very complex and very risky, and it can lead to a lot of damage, whether it's property, whether it's to the environment, or whether people become injured, for example. And that, of course, leads to liabilities for ship owners and then claims. And, insurance in shipping comes in all shapes and sizes. And I think that's why, there are so many brokers in the shipping industry, because it's a very complex area. So there's special insurance for ships' hulls, for cargo to be carried, and for third-party liabilities. And that's what P&I is all about. Back in the 19th century, when insurance was born, ship owners, they wanted to insure these liabilities, which they might incur if they, for example, were found to be at fault in a collision. But the marine underwriters at that time, they weren't willing to take on these kind of open-ended risks. It's different if you have a ship, a piece of property. You know what the value of that ship is, and so you know that there is a limit to the insurance cover that will be provided. But where you have a liability towards a third party in certain situations, that liability cannot be quantified upfront. So the ship owners decided they needed to find their own solution. And what they did was they decided to form a cooperative. They clubbed together and formed their own mutual non-profit cooperative, which have now become known as protection and indemnity clubs. And what these clubs do is, the ship owners, they are expected to contribute towards a common risk. And they do that by paying premiums, or calls as we call them, into this club. And there are some managers of the club who then, amongst other things, invest those premiums and make funds that are available to pay out in the event that there is a claim. And of course, there are certain rules and insurance policy conditions that would need to be complied with and followed when adjusting any claims that come in. And over the years, this cover has gradually expanded, and it has kind of developed, I would say, to fill in the gaps where the other insurance policies that you have with marine insurance are lacking. And so one of the main exceptions to P&I cover is that you cannot claim under P&I insurance if there is other insurance available. So the main areas that are covered are liabilities relating to cargo, pollution, collision, and people. And the member, where the member has incurred any losses or has incurred costs and expenses, as long as those are in direct connection with the operation of the ship that has been entered in the club, then P&I insurance cover should be available, subject to any special exceptions. And I can tell you a funny story, actually, about the formation of the Gard Club. Back in the 19th century, Arendal had actually become the main centre in Norway for shipping and the shipbuilding industry. And there were many ship owners based here. And they were members of a P&I club, which was based in Oslo and still exists today. And as the steamship era evolved, ship owners wanted to enter the steamships into the club to cover risks for liabilities arising out of operating steamships. But the ship owners in Arendal were very conservative and thought that steamships were far too risky. And so they decided to leave the club in Oslo, and 17 ship owners set up their own P&I club here in Arendal back in 1907, and Gard was born. But of course, they soon realized that steamships were the future, and so Gard also started to underwrite risks arising out of operating steamships. And then, it went on to tankers, and it was insuring mainly Norwegian and Scandinavian ship owners for many, many years. But then, I think it was in the early 70s, it started to get international ship owner members. And we also branched out into the offshore energy areas. And in the year 2000, Gard also diversified and expanded into offshore energy and hull and machinery. And the most recent area that we have ventured into is now wind farms.
So many different interesting areas, I think. And what is your responsibility? What do you do in your everyday job?
Well, a little bit more background about my career in Gard. When I joined Gard, I joined to handle what used to be called FD&D claims, freight demurrage and defence claims, and I think we now tend to refer to them as defence claims, and an additional insurance that is provided usually by P&I clubs, and it can either be on a mutual basis, but I think more usually now it's become more of a kind of additional fixed premium insurance. And there are some specialist clubs that have been set up purely to provide this type of insurance. And that insurance is basically for legal and other costs that might be incurred by a ship owner or a charterer in connection with claims, again, arising out of the operation of a ship. So the claim amount is not insured, but the legal costs involved in pursuing or defending such claims are covered. And these types of claims usually arise under contracts, specifically charter parties and bills of lading and so on. So I started off my career at Gard handling those types of claims, and then I moved into a leader position at the end of the 90s, and I became the global head of defence. And then about 6 years ago, I was given the opportunity of moving to the P&I part of the business, and I became the global head of people claims. And I feel that this was a really good move for me. For me, it felt much more rewarding to make a difference to a seafarer's or another person's health and life than to argue about which contractual party should win a dispute. And if I have any regrets about my career, which I don't really, but one might be, why hadn't I done that sooner rather than later? So I held that position until the end of last year. Now I'm just counting down the weeks because I'll be retiring next month.
What was it that you found so rewarding with working with people's claims?
Well, I think it is because you can make a difference to the medical treatment, for example, that a seafarer receives by moving the injured or ill crew member from a public hospital to perhaps a specialist private one that might not ordinarily have been possible. Or by, for example, facilitating a crew member's family member to travel out to be with that crew member whilst they're in hospital and recovering. I think it's those kinds of very basic human needs that you're able to meet in a good way. It enables you to make a difference to a human being. I'm not saying that the environment is not important, and of course a lot of tremendously good work is done in that area. And, a lot of my colleagues are involved in that type of work. But for me, to make a difference to a person's life has really had a big impact on me.
When do you get into the process or when there is a claim? Is it a sort of emergency, or is it sort of after the most urgent situation is settled, or when do you?
No, it really depends, of course, from case to case, but we can be involved from the emergency situation, or it can be later on when the crew member has been transferred to a hospital, or it could be much later on. It depends on the severity of the case. If it is something that simply a doctor needs to look at ashore, then we don't get involved in the mechanics of that. So it's with the more serious cases, or whenever our ship owner member meets a problem. And as you can imagine, when the pandemic hit, our members really needed as much assistance as they could get, particularly with their crew. And so we became very involved, and very involved from the very start that a seafarer was injured or became ill or caught COVID.
Yeah, that is, the seafarers are the unsung heroes of the pandemic. I think so. And if we could imagine, a ship which is in quarantine or something, and then someone falls ill, how do you handle that? How do you get to take care of them? How do you get them off the ship? How do you get them into the hospital? I don't know, maybe you could share something about that.
If the ship is in quarantine in a faraway place, we have a network of correspondents around the world who basically in all the main ports around the world, we have an established relationship with what we call a P&I correspondent. And they are our kind of eyes and ears on the ground, and they are the ones that do an awful lot of hard work and help us locally. In the pandemic, everything changed. And I would like to share a few examples of the difficulties that the seafarers face and the ship owners and us as a club because, little did I know that the last 2 years of my career would actually be the most challenging of all. And I have a particular point that I would like to make, since I have the opportunity to speak on this podcast and to your listeners, which is this really. A pandemic, it's a known global risk. We've had minor epidemics of infectious diseases, not so long ago in the noughties, with Ebola, for example, and SARS and avian flu as well. But, I think even not so long before the COVID pandemic hit, there were key organizations around the world who were warning governments that a pandemic will happen sooner or later, and there needs to be more preparedness for such an event. And there were also influential individuals like Bill Gates, for example, who was predicting that the pandemic could come any time, and yet there was this absolute lack of global preparedness for any such event. And, that is, for me, one of the worst things about the pandemic, that this came true, particularly for shipping, and especially for our seafarers. And there's been an awful lot of talk, of course, about the crew crisis and the fact that hundreds of thousands of crew were stranded on board ships. But I would like to share today a couple of examples which have not been so talked about. The first one really concerns getting medical assistance to crew who either became ill from, it could have been any kind of illness, not COVID related, or who caught COVID, or who had become injured on board the ship when during the pandemic. And it was particularly early on in the pandemic, but it did continue for quite some time, and I mean more than 1 year, where we would have a situation with a seafarer needing urgent medical assistance. Sometimes the seafarer even had a life-threatening condition, and time again, many countries simply refused to provide the medical assistance. I find that astonishing in this day and age, but it just goes to show that, countries, they almost had this kind of NIMBY approach, not in my backyard. We have our own problems. We have to look after our own people. And okay, you might have a seafarer who needs urgent medical help, but I'm afraid we cannot help. And there's absolutely no doubt that seafarers' health during the pandemic really has suffered, partly because of delayed medical treatment. And I just find that, very, in this day and age, it's so difficult to understand that individual countries would take that approach. But it happened. And another terrible situation that we encountered in quite a few cases is that countries would refuse to repatriate the bodies of crew who had passed away on board ships. And, we had one case where a deceased master was on board for more than 6 months. Can you imagine how his loved ones felt about that? And also, not forgetting the master's crew who were still on board, or many of them remained on board. And, the fact that the master's body was having to be kept on board a ship, which obviously is not built to perform that kind of function. So this was really a terrible situation. And in one of our cases, the ship owner decided that the only way that the body could be transported home would be to take it themselves on the ship. So the ship was diverted from a port in the Far East all the way back to Italy, simply to transport the body of the deceased master home. So I think that, these examples are really shocking in 2020, 2021.
Yes, I agree. And why does this happen? I mean, I think that people who doesn't work in our industry doesn't know how it works. And that includes the governmental people.
It does indeed. And I think, during the pandemic, we know that the governments around the world, or at least the governments who are member states of the IMO, they were called upon by the IMO to recognize seafarers as key workers. And I think there are 175 countries who are member states. And at least as at October last year, I know that only 62 had designated seafarers as key workers. And, even where they have designated seafarers as key workers, it doesn't necessarily mean that they have also put in the infrastructure to ensure that everything should work as proposed, because it's not only about saying that a seafarer is a key worker. There needs to be other changes to ensure that they can change crew safely, that their travel arrangements are expedited, repatriation is made as easy as possible, and of course access to both medical care and also vaccinations. So I don't know what the answer is, but or what the key can be to make something happen. But my strong view is that this does need to happen at governmental level rather than industry. And there have been tremendous initiatives within the shipping industry. The industry itself has really put the seafarer at its centre and really highlighted the seafarer, the work they do and the rights that they have, but how to lift this out of the private sector, if you like, and up to the government level, in my view, is the challenge. And my real big concern, and this is my private personal opinion, it's not that of Gard's, but I don't know what's being done at government or state level now, whether or not this remains on the agenda to ensure that this global preparedness for the next pandemic will be in place. Because, we know it's inevitable. It will come. We don't know if it will come next year or if it will come in 50 years or 100 years. But we cannot have a repeat performance of what happened during the last 2 years. And we're still not out of the woods yet. The pandemic, I don't think the pandemic has been declared a non-pandemic now. So we are still in it, and there are still a lot of issues, particularly in those countries that are still having a lot of COVID infections. But what I'm worried is that for those who have come a little bit out of the pandemic, that, we can take a deep breath and think, oh, it's over. And then, this very, very important issue disappears until the next time.
There's so many different angles to, I think we should discuss, and you might be so much more knowledgeable than I am. But we have got all the different flag states, we've got all the different governments where shipping is a big part of their income to the state, to the government, because the people who are living there pay tax. And also you have other benefits that you might have because you have a big part of the global shipping industry. So there are benefits to the governments And maybe where there are a lot of seafarers, they know that there are benefits to have a lot of seafarers. On the other hand, maybe they are not the strongest proponents for or advocates for at the IMO or at the UN, because I think it's got to do with the United Nations. It has to be on the very top level.
Absolutely, and I think that the big seafaring nations, they tend to be less developed countries, I think. I listened to the really amazing podcast that you did with Frank Cole, and he had, some really radical views, but he really said some thought-provoking things. But I thought, one of his ideas was that if the USA could be a driving force, then that might be a possible way of getting this onto the agenda of global governments. But how to do that, I do not know. And also, of course, the EU is another big driving force. So if a way could be found to have them drive an initiative, then of course that might be the answer.
Mm. And we also got Ukraine as one of the governments that has been supporting seafarers to the global community as well.
Yes.
For different reasons, of course, because now they got other problems on their plate, of course.
Yes.
But something that maybe people do not know is that seafarers from both Ukraine and Russia could be sailing on the same ship together. And that is a different story than the story we hear in headlines.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah, there's so many things I come to think about, but we could talk for days about this, Alice. There's so many different angles, and Frank is, of course, a very controversial person, but I think his heart is in the right place, and he is standing up for the community of seafarers in a way that maybe they are not able themselves to do.
Absolutely.
So it was a bit controversial, and I got a bit of criticism for letting him speak, but I'm the producer of this podcast, so I can talk to whoever I want.
Well, I think if you have diversity among your participants, then you will hear so many different views and get many different ideas.
Yeah, I do. I definitely do. And I want the world to hear them, the different people's stories. I mean, this is storytelling, but it's the only way we can tell the story so people know about what we're doing and what we're not doing in our industry.
Another area in which we are involved, and which is also a very sad part of the shipping industry, is abandonment of seafarers. Unfortunately, there are not too many ship owners who have insured with an international P&I club, international group P&I club, who abandon their crew, but it does happen from time to time. And, there was a change, I think it was back in 2018, where seafarers do have a little bit more protection than they had before. And that is in the form of the P&I clubs now have a responsibility to both repatriate the seafarers when they are abandoned, and also to make sure that, they have what they need whilst they're on board the ship, as well as a responsibility to cover part of their unpaid wages. So that was a good development, but it's still, it's quite shocking that, these things can happen. And, we have had a case where crew were abandoned on board a ship, and this was in the Middle East. And, it took well over a year to be able to send the remaining crew that had been abandoned back home. And it took a huge effort through negotiations with the relevant port authority in order to make that happen. There are so many different interests to balance. It's not as easy as it should be to resolve these difficult situations. And unfortunately, the seafarers have to bear the brunt of these situations. And, there is still the challenge of piracy. I think it has improved slightly in recent years, but that is still a challenge. We don't get so involved with those cases in P&I because very often the ship owner buys a special type of insurance for that. And then there's also, criminalisation of seafarers, where there might be a case where there has been a pollution, for example, and wherever that happens in the world, in that particular jurisdiction, that might be looked on as a criminal act. And the authorities will then sometimes arrest and sometimes detain some of the crew in that country, and that can be done for months, even a year, or it could be a case of drug smuggling on board a ship with which the crew had absolutely nothing to do, but some of the crew are taken off and detained and effectively put on trial. So, there are a lot of challenging and out of the ordinary situations that a seafarer can face, in addition to having a very unusual job anyway, by being at sea for long periods of time and away from family. So it's a very challenging profession and challenging environment, and we should be able to make it better.
What are the biggest changes that you have seen during your career?
If we lighten the mood a little bit, when I first joined Gard, I had never used a word processor or a computer. And, it was very usual for claims documents to come by letter in the post. And I remember learning to use the telex machine, and that was so exciting because you could communicate by telex with the ship, the master on the ship, and that was really fun. So things moved a lot more slowly. And you asked earlier on about, when we got involved, and in those days we probably were much less involved in the emergency situation, and it was more dealing with the aftermath. But now, everything is immediate, and as soon as an email comes into your inbox, the expectation on the other side is pretty high for a quick response. So things have become a lot faster, and of course we didn't have the internet, and so if you wanted to do any research about a claim, you'd go to a library and look in paper books, and now you get what you need and more, within seconds at your fingertips. And, we had no mobile or smart telephones in those days. And we used to have every couple of months, we would be on duty, on call for a week. And the duty phone was this huge contraption in a great big suitcase that you would have to lug around. And yes, things have changed. And I think, on the communication side, probably for the better. And, within Gard, the Gard Club, when I joined, we were under 100 people, and everyone knew everybody and their partners and their kids. And now this year, I think Gard will actually exceed over 600 employees. So, there have been massive changes over the years. In shipping, well, of course, as I mentioned, we have technology, and of course, there's huge advances in technology on ships. And I think that's been really positive. From a people claim perspective, we have seen a decrease in people claims over the years. And I think that is partly because of technology. A lot of processes have been automated, putting crew less at risk. So I think that's been very positive. there are much bigger ships these days, particularly in the container and cruise industries, and smaller crews, apart from maybe the cruise industry where they still have very, very large crews. There have definitely been fewer major incidents. So, back to the technology point, I think that, there have been big advances in safety at sea, which is very, very good. Again, from a people point of view, I think that mental health has become much more into the spotlight, which is very positive, so that there's much more openness around mental health. There is still a stigma, I think, particularly among seafarers, because I think it takes a certain type of person anyway to go to sea, and I don't think they are so much at ease about talking about things like mental health. But we are making progress slowly in that direction. And, possibly one of the contributors to mental health, maybe in both a positive and a negative way, is, of course, social media. Everyone knows that for seafarers in particular, that can be a double-edged sword, and it does add pressure. And we mustn't forget that not that many seafarers have a great deal of access to the internet, and so it can be very limited in terms of access to their social media, and that can also, create problems. So again, on people claims, we have had the introduction of the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, which came in, I think it was 2018. That's very positive for the seafarers, because, and whilst this applies or is a European originating regulation, it does apply to many seafarers' data. So, we are obliged now to minimize the amount of data that we have. There has to be a specific purpose for having it. It has to be completely secure, and there is a limit to how long we can hold it for. So that has been a change, and we've had the MLC abandonment financial security provision come in, as I said. So we're now able to help seafarers in abandoned situations in a better way. So, from my perspective, those are really the main changes that I have experienced.
Did you have a role model growing up?
I think I can only really say my parents. It was so different growing up all those years ago than it is today. Maybe a teacher as well. But, I think as I have got older, I just see myself more and more in my parents, and I don't think they're bad ways that I've inherited. So I think I would say, I have basically followed their values. Although I have noticed that I have become Norwegianized, Scandinavianized from living here. So I like to think I have the best of both worlds in terms of values and so on.
Do you consider yourself a role model today?
Oh, I would like to. I have mentored people throughout my career, and it's been wonderful to watch them flourish. So I would like to think of myself as a role model.
I think you are. That is at least what I hear. Thank you, Alice. This was really a great episode, I think. It was a very interesting discussion. And thank you for taking the time, and best of luck for your future adventures. Maybe there will be a more sailing period now. I don't know.
I hope so. Thank you very much, Lena.
Thank you, Alice. I truly enjoyed our conversation. As you know, and I know, the battery on my recorder went flat. So we didn't have the time to speak about who you would be interested in listening to on the Shipping Podcast. So heads up now, I'm after you if you hear your name. Jacqueline Smith, Marine Coordinator at ITF, International Transport Workers Federation, and Executive Board Member of the World Maritime University. Nick Shaw, CEO of the International Group of P&I Clubs. Gillian Grant, Canada's Permanent Representative at the IMO. Johanna Christensen, CEO of the Global Maritime Forum. Lin Lu, CEO of Global Center for Decarbonization in Singapore. Lars Lange at IOMI. And Grant Hunter, who's working with strategy and innovation for BIMCO. Thank you for listening, and as I said, if any one of my listeners know any one of those people who Alice wanted to listen to on the Shipping Podcast, please drop me a line at hello@shippingpodcast.com so I can reach them. That's all for today, folks. So, from me to you, over and out. Thank you for listening to the Shipping Podcast. Don't forget to tell everyone that you meet that there is a Shipping Podcast available and that they should download it and listen to the maritime professionals who are sharing their passion for the shipping industry.